When my success threatened my father's pride, he launched a family feud that left no stone unturned. This golden child's burden, and then I grew up believing that success was measured by how much you could take care of your family. That was the mantra my father, Mark, lived by, or at least, that's what he told me and my younger brother, Ryan. Mark was the sort of man who would talk about the good old days when he worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, and he never let us forget it. It wasn't resentment, exactly, it was pride. And for a long time, I admired him for it. But things shifted when I hit my mid-20s. By then, I was running my own tech startup, something Mark didn't understand and didn't try to. He called it playing on the computer and made it clear he didn't think much of my fancy degree. At first, I brushed it off. He was old school, and I figured he'd come around once he saw the fruits of my labor. Spoiler alert, he didn't. The real crack in our relationship happened 6 months ago. My company landed a major client, and overnight, our revenue skyrocketed. I was finally in a position to buy my first home, a sleek, modern townhouse in a neighborhood that my parents once described as too rich for us. When I invited my family over for dinner to celebrate, I had no idea it would turn into a disaster. The night started out fine, or as fine as it could be when my father and I were in the same room. My mom, Karen, brought her famous lasagna, and my brother, Ryan, showed up late as usual but with a bottle of wine, so I couldn't complain. Sophia, my girlfriend, tried her best to keep things light by asking Ryan about his job search, but my father quickly took over the conversation. "Ryan's just waiting for the right opportunity," Mark said with a pointed look in my direction. "Not everyone gets lucky with some computer thing." Sophia's smile froze, and I could feel my chest tighten. "It's not just luck, Dad," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I've worked hard to build this from the ground up." "Well, it must be nice to have the luxury to take those risks," he shot back, stabbing his fork into his lasagna. "Some of us didn't have that option." It was the same argument we'd been having for years, but this time, something in me snapped. Maybe it was the months of passive-aggressive comments or the way he looked at me, as if my success was a personal affront. Or maybe it was the wine. Either way, I couldn't hold back. "Dad, do you ever stop to think that maybe I'm successful because of my hard work, not in spite of it?" I asked. "You raised me to work for what I want, and now that I have, you're acting like it's a bad thing." The room went silent. My mom stared at her plate, and Ryan looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Sophia reached for my hand, but I pulled away, too fired up to calm down. Mark set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "You don't get it, do you, Derek?" he said, his voice low. "It's not about what you've done. It's about what you've forgotten. Family comes first. Always. Family," I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean the family you've spent years trying to control? The family you belittle every time we don't live up to your standards?" Karen finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "Please, let's not do this tonight." But it was too late. Mark stood up, towering over the table. "You think you're better than me now? Is that it? Because you've got a nice house and some money in the bank?" "No, Dad," I said, standing up to face him. "I think I've worked hard to get where I am, and I'm tired of you tearing me down because you can't handle it." That was the last straw for him. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. My mom quickly followed, apologizing as she went. Ryan stayed behind for a few minutes, but he didn't say much, just finished his wine and muttered something about how I should have known better than to push Dad's buttons. When they were gone, Sophia and I sat in silence. I wanted to feel victorious, like I'd finally stood up for myself, but all I felt was empty. "He's jealous, you know," Sophia said softly. "He's scared because you've outgrown him." I wanted to disagree, to tell her that wasn't true, but deep down, I knew she was right. My success wasn't just my victory. It was a reminder of what Mark thought he could have been if life had been kinder to him. And he hated me for it. The dinner was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Mark turned our feud into a full-blown war. He started calling Ryan more often, inviting him over for father-son bonding time and dropping little digs about me every chance he got. My mom tried to play peacemaker, but even she couldn't hide the fact that Mark was spiraling. I thought I could ignore it, focus on my work and my relationship with Sophia. But Mark wasn't about to let me off that easy. He had his pride, and he wasn't going down without a fight. After that disastrous dinner, I tried to move on. My focus shifted back to work, where there was always a new fire to put out or a milestone to hit. But even as I buried myself in code and contracts, my father's words echoed in my mind. Family comes first. Always. I couldn't decide if it was an accusation or a warning. Mark didn't leave me much time to figure it out. A few days later, Ryan called me, sounding more nervous than usual. "Hey, Derek," he began, dragging out my name like he was preparing for a confession. "Dad wants me to help him with something." I frowned. Help him with what? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Fixing up the old shed," Ryan said finally. "But he's been talking a lot about you." "Of course he has," I muttered, already bracing myself. "What's he saying now?" Ryan hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know. He didn't want to get involved, but he also didn't want to lie to me. That was the thing about Ryan. He was the golden child in my father's eyes, but he hated conflict. Growing up, he'd always played the peacemaker, smoothing over fights between Mark and me, even when it meant putting his own feelings aside. "Look, I'm just saying," Ryan said at last. "Maybe you should call him. Try to patch things up." I nearly laughed. "Patch things up? You were at the dinner, Ryan. Dad's the one who stormed out." "I know," he said quickly, "but you know how he gets. He doesn't mean half the stuff he says. And the other half?" Ryan didn't answer. I could picture him sitting in his cramped apartment, running a hand through his messy hair. He dropped out of college a year ago, much to my father's disappointment, and now he was juggling part-time jobs while trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. Mark didn't make it easy for him. Every time I saw them together, it was the same routine. Mark would criticize Ryan's choices, and Ryan would nod along, too tired to fight back. "Look, I'll think about it," I said finally, though I had no intention of calling Mark. "But don't let him drag you into his games, okay? You've got enough on your plate." Ryan mumbled something that sounded like agreement before hanging up. I sighed and put my phone down, feeling a familiar mix of frustration and guilt. No matter how far I got in life, my father always found a way to pull me back into the drama. A week later, I found out just how far he was willing to go. Sophia and I were at a small networking event for local entrepreneurs when I overheard two men talking about me. "Yeah, his dad's been saying some pretty wild stuff," one of them said. "Apparently, Derek's business isn't as clean as it looks." My stomach dropped. I stepped closer, pretending to check my phone, and caught the rest of the conversation. "He said Derek used family money to get started," the other man said, "and that he's been cutting corners to stay afloat." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father, my own father, was spreading lies about me. I felt a surge of anger, but it was quickly followed by something colder, heavier. Betrayal. When I confronted my mom about it the next day, she didn't deny it. "Your father's just upset, Derek," she said, her voice soft and tired. "You know how he gets when he feels like he's losing control." "That's not an excuse, Mom," I snapped. "He's trying to ruin my reputation." Karen sighed, and for the first time, I saw just how exhausted she looked. "He's not trying to ruin you," she said. "He's scared. He thinks he's losing his family." I wanted to argue, to tell her that this wasn't about fear. It was about pride. But the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't just tired. She was defeated. It was as if years of keeping the peace had finally caught up to her. "Why do you let him get away with this?" I asked quietly. "Why don't you ever stand up to him?" Karen looked away, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she said something that stayed with me. "Because I've seen what happens when I do." Meanwhile, Ryan was caught in the crossfire. Mark started calling him almost every day, asking for help with various projects and slipping in comments about me whenever he could. Ryan tried to brush it off, but I could tell it was wearing on him. "He's been weird lately," Ryan admitted one evening when we met up for drinks. "Like, he keeps bringing up stuff from when we were kids, like how he taught us to ride bikes or how he used to fix our lunches." I frowned. "What's he trying to prove?" "I don't know," Ryan said, swirling his drink. "But it's like, he's trying to remind me of all the good stuff, you know? Like he's afraid I'll forget." I didn't know what to say to that. It was clear that Mark was using Ryan to get back at me, but it was also clear that Ryan didn't know how to handle it. He wanted to make our father happy, but he also didn't want to take sides. It was a no-win situation, and Mark knew it. Things came to a head when Karen let something slip during a phone call. She was trying to explain Mark's behavior again, telling me about the pressures he faced when he was younger. But in the middle of her explanation, she said something that stopped me cold. Your father always wanted to start his own business, she said. But he couldn't, not with the boys to take care of. I froze. What are you talking about? He's never mentioned that before. Karen hesitated, as if she'd said too much. It was a long time ago, she said quickly, before you were born. He had an opportunity, but he turned it down to focus on the family. The pieces started to fall into place. Mark's bitterness, his constant need to undermine me. It wasn't just about my success. It was about his failure. He saw in me the life he could have had, and he couldn't stand it. I wanted to confront him right then and there, but Sophia convinced me to wait. You need to think this through, she said. If you go in angry, it's just going to escalate. She was right, of course, but waiting didn't make it any easier. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. My father had spent years making me feel like I wasn't good enough, all because he couldn't handle his own insecurities. And now he was dragging Ryan into it too. Something had to change. But I had no idea how to make that happen without tearing the family apart. The drama with my father had been simmering for weeks when Zachary, or Zach as he insisted we call him, came into the picture. He was a cousin I barely knew, a name I'd only heard in passing from my mother when she talked about her extended family. But one evening, he showed up unannounced at my door, wearing a casual grin and carrying a six-pack of beer like he'd known me forever. Derek, right? He said, leaning against the doorframe. I figured it's about time we met. Sophia looked up from the couch, startled by the sudden arrival. Who's this? Cousin Zach, he said before I could answer. Well, second cousin, technically. Heard a lot about you. I wasn't sure what to make of him. Zach had this easy confidence, the kind that made you wonder whether he was trustworthy or just really good at pretending. He looked about my age, maybe a year or two older, with sharp blue eyes and a crooked smile that hinted at mischief. I hope it's the good stuff you've heard, I said, stepping aside to let him in. What brings you here? Zach shrugged, setting the beers on the kitchen counter like he owned the place. Family, man. Your mom mentioned you were dealing with some tension. Figured I'd drop by, see if I could help. Sophia shot me a questioning look, and I gave her a subtle shrug. We didn't know this guy, but something told me to hear him out. As it turned out, Zach had a knack for getting people to talk. Within an hour, we were sitting around the living room, beers in hand, and he was spinning stories about his own family drama. He talked about his parents' messy divorce, his estranged relationship with his older brother, and how he'd learned to navigate tricky family dynamics. It's all about knowing when to push and when to pull back, he said, leaning back in his chair. Sometimes, you just have to let people dig their own graves. I wasn't sure if he meant that literally or figuratively, but there was something about his bluntness that I found refreshing. For once, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of the conversation. So, what's the deal with your dad? Zach asked casually. He's got a reputation for being intense. I hesitated, glancing at Sophia, who gave me a small nod. If Zach was here to help, he needed the full story. I told him everything. The years of passive-aggressive comments, the constant undermining, the lies he was spreading about my business. Zach listened intently, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle. Man, that's rough, he said. Sounds like he's got some serious control issues. You think? I said dryly. Zach chuckled. No offense, but your dad sounds like my Uncle Greg. The guy spent years trying to sabotage my mom after their divorce. Some people just can't stand the idea of not being in charge. His words struck a chord. Mark wasn't just lashing out because of jealousy. He was trying to maintain control over a family that no longer needed him to be the center of the universe. Over the next few weeks, Zach became a regular presence in my life. He started dropping by unannounced, offering advice and acting as a sounding board whenever I needed to vent. At first, I found his laid-back attitude comforting, but the more I got to know him, the more I realized he wasn't just here for moral support. Zach had his own agenda. It started with little things, questions about my business, casual mentions of opportunities he'd heard about in the tech world. Then one day, he asked if I'd be willing to let him invest in my company. "I'm not looking for anything major," he said, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "Just a small stake. I think you've got something really special here." I didn't know what to say. On one hand, the extra capital could be useful, especially with some of the projects I had in the pipeline. On the other hand, I barely knew this guy, and something about the timing felt off. Why was he suddenly so interested in my business? "I'll think about it," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Zach nodded, but I could tell he was disappointed. "Fair enough. Just don't take too long. I'm not the only one who sees potential in what you're building." The comment felt like a warning, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ryan was growing more strained. He'd started spending more time with Mark, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my father was using him as a pawn in his vendetta against me. "You've got to talk to him," Sophia said one night as we sat on the couch, scrolling through Netflix but not really watching anything. "Ryan's caught in the middle, and it's not fair to him." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I know, but every time I try, it feels like I'm just making things worse." "Then try a different approach," she said. "Show him that you're on his side, even if your dad isn't." It was good advice, but easier said than done. Ryan had always been closer to Mark than I was, and I didn't want to risk alienating him even further. The breaking point came during a family gathering at my parents' house. Karen had insisted on hosting a barbecue, hoping it would be a chance for everyone to clear the air. I wasn't optimistic, but I showed up anyway, determined to keep the peace. Mark spent most of the afternoon ignoring me, which was fine by me. But as the sun started to set, he cornered me near the grill. "Ryan's been telling me about your business," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Sounds like you've got a lot on your plate." "I manage," I said, keeping my answers short. Mark nodded, flipping a burger with deliberate slowness. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe you're taking on too much. A little humility wouldn't hurt." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you could learn a thing or two about priorities," he said, his voice rising. "You're so busy chasing success, you've forgotten where you came from." "That's rich," I shot back. "You're the one who's been spreading lies about me." The conversation quickly devolved into a shouting match, and by the time it was over, Mark had stormed off, leaving me standing there, fists clenched and heart pounding. Later that night, Zach pulled me aside. "You can't keep letting him get under your skin," he said. "If you want to win this, you need to play smart." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Zach leaned in, his expression serious. "Your dad's not going to back down. You need leverage. Something that'll make him think twice before he messes with you again." It was the first time Zach's mask of easy charm had slipped, and for a moment, I saw the calculating mind behind it. He wasn't just here to help, he was here to gain something. And I wasn't sure if I could trust him, but as much as I hated to admit it, he had a point. If I wanted to stop Mark, I needed to fight fire with fire. And I had a feeling Zach knew exactly where to start. After the barbecue, something shifted in me. I was done trying to reason with my father. Every time I extended an olive branch, he either ignored it or snapped it in two. If Mark wanted a war, fine, but I wasn't going to keep fighting on his terms. Zach's words stayed with me. Leverage. I wasn't proud of the idea, but maybe he was right. If I wanted to end this feud, I needed something that would force Mark to back off. The problem was, I had no idea where to start. That's where Zach came in. One afternoon, Zach and I met for coffee at a quiet cafe downtown. He'd been bugging me to sit down and strategize, and despite my better judgment, I agreed. "So," Zach began, leaning back in his chair, "you want to figure out what makes your dad tick?" "More like what's making him spiral," I corrected. Zach grinned. "Fair enough. The good news is, everyone's got skeletons in their closet. The bad news is, it's not always easy to find them." I raised an eyebrow. "You seem awfully confident about this." He shrugged. "Let's just say I've had my fair share of experience digging up dirt. Family feuds tend to bring out the investigator in me." I wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned, but I decided to play along. Okay, so what do we do? We start with the basics, Zach said, pulling out a small notebook. I've already done a little digging, and there are a few things about your dad's past that don't quite add up. I leaned forward, curiosity piqued. Like what? Zach flipped through his notes, then looked up at me with a sly smile. Did you know your dad once owned a small business? My heart skipped a beat. He told me he never had the chance. Yeah, well, he wasn't exactly telling the whole truth, Zach said. It was a construction company. Small time, but it had potential. The thing is, it went under pretty quickly. Word is, there was some shady stuff going on behind the scenes. Shady stuff? I repeated, my stomach twisting. Like what? Fraud, Zach said bluntly. Nothing major, but enough to get him blacklisted from a few contracts. He managed to keep it quiet, though. Your mom might know more. That night, I called my mom. She sounded surprised to hear from me, but I didn't waste time on small talk. Mom, I need to ask you something, I said. Did Dad ever own a business? There was a long pause. Why are you asking about that? She said finally. Because I think he's hiding something, I said. And I need to know the truth. Karen sighed, and I could tell she was debating whether to answer. It was a long time ago, Derek. Before you and Ryan were born. He started a construction company with a friend, but it didn't work out. Why not? Because your father made some mistakes, she admitted. He didn't handle the finances well, and there were accusations of mismanagement. He had to shut it down. Accusations? I pressed. What kind of accusations? Karen hesitated. There were rumors about fraud, but nothing was ever proven. He was young and in over his head. It was a hard time for both of us. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for Mark, but another part of me was furious. He'd spent years criticizing my choices, all while hiding his own failures. And now, he was trying to tear me down because he couldn't stand to see me succeed where he had failed. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked quietly. Because your father didn't want you to know, Karen said. He was embarrassed. And he didn't want you to think less of him. It was almost laughable. The man who had spent my entire life pointing out my flaws was terrified of me seeing his. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't funny at all. It was just sad. Over the next few days, I dug deeper into Mark's past. Zach helped, of course. He seemed to have a knack for finding things that weren't meant to be found. We discovered old business records, contracts, and even a lawsuit that had been quietly settled out of court. The evidence wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to paint a clear picture. Mark had taken shortcuts, and when those shortcuts caught up to him, he'd paid the price. The hardest part was deciding what to do with the information. Zach, predictably, wanted to use it as leverage. You don't have to go nuclear, he said. Just let him know you know. That'll be enough to keep him in check. But Sophia disagreed. What's your endgame here? She asked. Do you really want to stoop to his level? She had a point, but it wasn't that simple. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about Ryan, too. My brother was being dragged into a feud he didn't start, and I couldn't let that continue. If exposing Mark's past was the only way to end it, wasn't it worth it? The decision was made for me when Mark showed up at my office one afternoon. He'd never visited before, so seeing him standing in the lobby, looking out of place in his wrinkled shirt and jeans, was enough to set me on edge. What are you doing here? I asked, keeping my voice steady. We need to talk, he said, his tone curt. I led him into a conference room, closing the door behind us. Mark wasted no time getting to the point. I know you've been digging into my past, he said, his eyes narrowing. Karen told me. I didn't bother denying it. And I want to know what you're planning to do with what you've found, he said. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. For the first time, he looked uncertain, vulnerable. It was a side of him I wasn't used to seeing. I haven't decided yet, I said honestly. But maybe you should be more worried about what Ryan might think. Mark's jaw tightened. Leave Ryan out of this. Why? You haven't. I shot back. You've been using him to get back at me, and it's not fair. He deserves to know the truth about you. The whole truth. For a moment, Mark didn't say anything. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and steady. You think you're better than me, don't you? Because you've got money and success? But let me tell you something, Derek. Family isn't about who's on top. It's about loyalty. And right now, you're tearing this family apart. I laughed bitterly. I'm tearing the family apart? You've been doing that for years, Dad. I'm just finally standing up to you. Mark glared at me, but there was something else in his eyes. Something that looked a lot like regret. Without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Later that night, Zach called me with another revelation. I found something else, he said. Something big. What is it? I asked, my heart racing. I'll tell you in person, he said. But trust me, this changes everything. Zach showed up at my door that night, looking unusually tense. He didn't bother with his usual charm or small talk. Instead, he walked straight into the living room, a manila folder clutched in his hand. This is it, he said, dropping the folder on the coffee table in front of me. This is what your dad didn't want you to find. Sophia sat beside me, watching quietly as I opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, letters, and old photographs. At first glance, it didn't make much sense, but as I sifted through the pages, a pattern started to emerge. What am I looking at? I asked, my voice low. Your dad didn't just shut down his old business because of fraud, Zach said. He had a partner, a guy named Tim Callahan. They got into some serious debt, and when things went south, your dad pinned the blame on him. I frowned, flipping through the papers. Pinned the blame how? Zach hesitated, then said, he fabricated evidence. Made it look like Tim was embezzling from the company. The guy lost everything. His reputation, his business, his family. My stomach churned. And Dad got away with it? Barely, Zach said. There was an investigation, but your dad settled before it went to court. Tim didn't have the resources to fight it. Sophia leaned forward, her face pale. Why would Mark do something like that? Pride, Zach said simply. He couldn't handle the idea of failure, so he made sure someone else took the fall. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. If this was true, it wasn't just a case of Mark being a difficult father. It was a pattern of behavior. He had a history of tearing people down to protect his own ego. And now, he was doing the same thing to me. The next morning, I called Ryan and asked him to meet me for coffee. If I was going to confront Mark, I needed Ryan to know the truth first. When he showed up, he looked wary, like he already knew something was wrong. What's this about? He asked, sitting across from me. I slid the folder across the table. You need to see this. Ryan opened the folder and started reading. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to something that looked a lot like anger. Is this real? He asked, his voice shaking. It is, I said. Zach found the records. Mom confirmed some of it. Ryan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Why are you showing me this? Because you deserve to know who Dad really is, I said. And because I need your help to stop him. Ryan shook his head. Stop him from what? From dragging us down with him, I said. He's been using you to get to me, and it's not fair. You shouldn't have to take sides. Ryan was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, What do you want me to do? Just be honest with yourself, I said. And with him. Don't let him manipulate you anymore. The confrontation with Mark happened 2 days later. I'd asked him to meet me at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one would overhear our conversation. He showed up late, as usual, and slid into the booth across from me with a scowl. What's this about? He asked, crossing his arms. I placed the folder on the table between us. This. Mark glanced at it, then back at me. What is this supposed to be? It's your past, I said. The business you had, the partner you betrayed, the lies you told. I know everything. Mark's face darkened, but he didn't reach for the folder. You've been digging into things that don't concern you. They concern me, I said sharply. And they concern Ryan, too. You've been playing games with us, trying to control us, all because you can't deal with your own failures. Mark's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? I said, my voice rising. You've spent years tearing me down, trying to make me feel small. And for what? To make yourself feel better? Mark didn't answer, but I could see the cracks forming in his facade. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "I'm done letting you manipulate me," I said. "And I'm done letting you use Ryan as a pawn. If you want to be a part of this family, you need to own up to what you've done. Otherwise, you're on your own." Mark stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up, leaving the folder untouched. "You think you're better than me," he said quietly, "but one day you'll see. Family isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about loyalty." With that, he walked out of the diner, leaving me alone at the table. The fallout was messy. Mark stopped talking to me entirely, and for a while, I wasn't sure if Ryan would, either. But over time, my brother and I started rebuilding our relationship, free from the shadow of our father's influence. Sophia stood by me through it all, reminding me that I didn't have to carry the weight of my family's dysfunction alone. As for Mark, I heard through my mom that he was struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but another part of me knew this was the path he'd chosen. He could either face his mistakes or continue living in denial. In the end, I realized that breaking the cycle wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing to move forward. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight of my father's expectations, his criticisms, and his bitterness was finally off my shoulders. And as I looked ahead to the future, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore.